Welcome to the DevLaunch podcast, bringing you insights from industry experts on how to grow the digital agency you love. In today's episode, we dive into the art of recruitment with Brett Snyder from Knucklepuck Media. Brett shares his journey from a one-man SEO consultant all the way to leading a people-focused agency that navigates the challenges of remote work, AI integration, and salary transparency. If you're looking to grow your agency without losing the human touch, this episode is a must listen. Well, welcome to the show, Brett Snyder. It's so wonderful to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, it's quite fun. Brett and I, for our listeners, Brett and I are both involved in a group called the Bureau of Digital, which if you don't already know about, would highly recommend go check it out. But I was really, really excited to have actually Brett's right-hand person reach out to me and say that she was interested in coming on the show and talking a little bit about. And as I got to know Brett and Knucklepuck, I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much here. We've got to dive in. So I really appreciate it, Brett, for you hopping on and talking us through. You've got a number of years of experience in this space and quite a journey. Would you mind sharing a little bit about specifically Knucklepuck? Like, what do you guys do? What do you specialize in?
Absolutely. So Knucklepuck is a digital marketing agency. We specialize exclusively on SEO and paid media advertising. And so we're looking very content focused, technical SEO, content focused on the SEO side of things, and really focused on efficiency of campaigns on the paid side. Being able to try to optimize towards your cost per acquisition number rather than a variable, conversion target, because our cost per acquisition focus really allows us to be much more flexible and to scale up or down, depending on client budgets, depending on seasonality. And the one other thing that we really pride ourselves on is, and we probably will talk about this today, I'm sure, but in the age of AI and all these tools, we are still very much a human company. And when we talk about AI internally, we talk about the things that Knucklepuck is investing in for the future of our culture, but also our organization. We really do try to make sure that the individuals that represent Knucklepuck are the focus. They're the ones that we prioritize our efforts around, and the tools and the technology we invest in is designed to empower those humans.
Yeah. And that was probably one of the biggest things as you and I had our first conversation that stood out to me. It is your people focus, your people centeredness in terms of just like not only how you guys go about working in your business, but also the ways that you hope to grow it. There's always such a focus on making sure that your people are front and center. So I'm going to read a quote here for a minute from Alex Hormozy, the infamous Alex Hormozy. He said something like, if you're running a professional services firm, your main problem to solve for is not sales. Your main problem is recruitment. What do you think of that idea? Like, do you agree with it? Do you disagree? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I actually think that recruitment kind of encompasses everything that you do in a professional services organization. And so you can talk about recruitment of the staff or the individuals that are going to have to go out there and deliver the product or service. You can also talk about recruiting salespeople who will go out there and help you promote and expand the footprint that we can actually reach. But I think one of the things that's really interesting to me when you talk about this is you really have to understand what roles you have in your organization and then how those roles are being fulfilled. So again, I kind of introduced a little bit on like the humans versus the technology side. On a professional services, I would argue it tends way, way more towards the human side of things, and the technology and the tools are there to support it. And so when you come at it from that lens, there is no business without recruitment of strong talent. And so I think when I talk about this and think about the idea of how our people represent the actual organization, I'm not meeting with our clients anymore, right? Like I'm not the one actually doing the work. When I started Knucklepuck, I was an SEO consultant. I started it out of my townhouse in Falls Church, Virginia, and I was doing all of it. And then as the company continued to grow over the last 10 years, we had to find other people to fill those roles, frankly, because they were better at it than me. And I think that's where when we talk about this idea of recruitment and being an important focus to it, you have to bring in that diversity of thought. You have to bring in other people who can advance your vision as a leader of an organization, and kind of the goals for product development, services development. It all comes from the people wielding the tools.
Yeah. Well, and if we're honest, though, that can be one of the hardest things, one of the hardest transitions as you're building your agency is like, I mean, like you and many other agency owners I've spoken with, you love your craft. Like doing the thing itself is actually really enjoyable. That's why you got into the business to begin with. So to make that transition away from you doing everything to now you empowering other people to do it, it's not necessarily the easiest thing in the world to do. I mean, was that your experience? Was it a super seamless transition, or was it like did it take some time before you could kind of hand those things off?
I think that answer varies dramatically depending on some of the roles that
Mm,
we've had over the years. And so, for example, it took me 4 times before I got into it, like an operations person that, really was able to run things and carry things forward largely independently of my direction. We've had other folks, especially on our delivery team, that we've hired as juniors many, many years ago, and now they are team leads and they're the people really driving that. And so in that example, we nailed it on day one. And so I think that's where you talk about this idea of recruitment, where you have to be able to understand that the people, whether you like it or not, the people are required, additional resources and people are required for your business to grow. I try to stay away from the concept of scale. I think this came from Promethean Research, gave this quote where it says agencies don't scale because the whole definition of scale is to extract more output from the same number of resources.
mm-hmm,
And that's not how human beings work.
mm-hmm.
And so we talk about some of these other pieces. If you want to be able to grow, you've got to be able to put people in the positions that can handle things better than you can, because you can't scale their time. You can scale the efficiency and their effectiveness with their time in the sense that you can find somebody more effective at a role than you are, but the individual itself doesn't scale. And so I think when we talk about this idea of recruitment and kind of the human resource component of it, you got to have the right people on the bus and you got to have the right people in the right seat. I'm pretty sure I'm taking that from EOS, is one of the EOS phrases,
Mm-hmm.
but that was one that really, really stuck with us because it's something you plan for in recruitment, but it's also something you have to validate after the person has been recruited and has joined the team, because sometimes your expectations aren't aligned. And sometimes that means you have to go out there and recruit alternative resources to be able to solve problems, whether those problems were existing and never resolved in the first place, or if they were problems that were surfaced as a result of changing circumstances. One major one that affected every human being on the planet was COVID. And people who had a workflow or had things that were much more conducive to their natural state before COVID maybe struggled a little bit more after. Maybe we had to recruit alternative resources to be able to service a different type of environment. I hope we're gonna talk about it a little bit later, but the push towards remote has been another one of those kind of topics, because we have this idea that people need to evolve with the organization. And COVID pushed a lot of people remote. We stayed remote after our lease expired. And that's been a big point that we've had to consistently reevaluate. Do we have the right people in the right seat? And those are very difficult conversations sometimes, because it's not always about effort or desire or commitment or passion. It's a matter of whether or not you have the right person to fulfill the role in your organization.
That's right. That's right. And it's possible that you have the right person, but just not necessarily in the right seat. Now, I'm guessing, we're using kind of some EOS methodology and terminology here. So I imagine you probably do have like an approach here that probably mirrors that, but like just maybe pulling on the thread of checking to see if you have the right people in the right seat. What is that routine? What's that kind of like regular cadence look like for reviewing your people?
Yeah, I think a lot of it came down to clear expectations up front. In EOS, I call it the accountability chart. Like, what are these different roles actually responsible for? What is the most important thing? 3 to 5 things that this role needs to be responsible for. And then you go through, they call it their GWC exercise. You see if somebody gets it, they want it, and they have the capacity to do it. And all 3 of those are important. There are people who get it, but don't want it. There are people who want it, who don't have the capacity to fulfill it. And so it is a challenging conversation at times, because it removes the personal aspect for it. One of the things that we actually hired an EOS implementer, Leslie Camacho, can't say enough about him. If you're considering doing EOS, like, definitely give Leslie a call. But it forced us to go down there and say, we're not going to use names. We're going to use roles. And we're going to say, what do we need in this role? And then we go and we evaluate whether the people that we have match the role. But what was super, super important for us up front was really being able to establish what we needed in the organization. And one of the things that we did in part of that exercise is we said, pick the 2 or 3 highest performers that we've ever had in the whole company. And if you could fill the entire roster with all of those people, what traits and what skills were consistently coming to the top? And that really started to inform the accountability chart, what we wanted in these roles. And then we go through the exercise to say, this person is a fit for the role, this person is not, but they might be a fit for somewhere else, or this person may not be a fit for the organization in the direction that we want to go, if we are legitimate about our commitment to the job roles that we established.
Now, by mere fact that you guys have that infrastructure in place and you have even the fact that you guys have implemented EOS, I imagine that's going to create kind of a gravitational pull of people towards you, right? Like excellent people are drawn to excellence. So I can imagine that could be in and of itself a solid recruiting tool. But I want to pull on another thing that you and I had talked about is kind of a forward-looking hiring practice, and that's specifically around pay transparency. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about your philosophy on pay transparency?
Do it. It's a difficult thing to do. It's a difficult thing to swallow because it requires a certain amount of vulnerability that your salary ranges may not be sufficient for some people. Some people may say this looks like it's less than it should be paid for it. But the reality is money is a finite commodity. We only have so much capital that we can invest in these various roles. I'm a big believer that, it's the same thing with business development. Everybody wants to say, have the budget conversation before you qualify the lead. Why should hiring and recruitment be any different? Why should you go through an entire process and then wait to the end and be like, so how much do you want to make? I think now it's illegal to ask what people currently make. And so everybody comes around with their other questions on how they get to it. And for us, we kind of looked at that and said, is this going to change the capital that we have available for this role? And I think it really helped us be a little bit more disciplined in the way that we look at hiring, because it's easy to look at some and be like, wow, this is like, I envision so many ways that this person could be an A player. I'd definitely go 10%, 20% over what I'd originally planned for it. But then you come back to that accountability chart and you come back to the fact that this is the role that I need be filled. This is how much of my total operating budget that I feel I can responsibly dedicate to that. And if you start going above and beyond that, you're not being disciplined to the role that you had outlined for it. And so for us, this was one of the things we actually did salary transparency probably in 2021. Megan Fury, who you'd mentioned before, had got us connected, was really the person who had pushed for that. And it really helped us in terms of the recruitment process overall, because on the one hand, now we get more qualified applications. If people don't know what a role is going to take, they are basing their perception of the salary range on the title. And anybody who's ever done any research on job titles knows that there's almost infinite variations of that people may think have very different ranges. And so a senior title may command 20, 30% more for one person versus the other. And so for us, just going out there and being able to say, part of our values are that we want to be kind of transparent and we want to show integrity in the way that we do these things. And so we tell people, this is what we can afford to pay for the role. If that isn't sufficient for your lifestyle, if it isn't sufficient for where you live to be able to maintain that, that doesn't change what we can afford to pay for the role and how we have assessed the value of that role to the organization. And so by putting that out there up front, we certainly got fewer applications, but I argue that as a win because we invested less resources in phone screening. Because at that point we were getting on a phone screen, we were getting through the end of it, and then we were asking the employee what their intended range would be, rather than us being able to go out there and say, we did our research. This is what we feel is competitive rates for this particular role as we've defined it. We have ranges in there because there's always gradations in terms of what somebody is, what somebody's skill set is. And it also allows us to be able to offer raises and promotions without having to do a role change. Raises, not without having to do promotions or a role change. And so I think we certainly got fewer candidates, but the candidates that we got went into it understanding this is what I'm applying for. not just the job, but this is the salary I'm applying for. It's still the most important thing to almost everybody. People, we talk a lot about like, oh, it's like commuting is like the second most important, and relationship with the manager is the first most. Money is still number one. Comp is still number one in terms of why people go to work. And so when we go out there and we say, this is what we can afford to pay for that, people are pre-qualifying themselves to be within our range. By virtue of applying to a job that explicitly states its comp, we have a certain degree of pre-qualification. If we get to the end of it in an interview and somebody says, hey, I want 20% more, we can go and say, like, that's not what we can offer here. And frankly, somebody that looks at that, and because we write about it, we are public in terms of why we've done this, when somebody doesn't understand exactly what I've just described to them, they may not be the right person for our organization, and they may not be the culture ad that we want them to be because their expectations are misaligned with what we can realistically offer.
Yeah. I mean, so you kind of had alluded to this too, but when you're talking about the process that people are going through, you said that maybe the total number of applications decreased, but if anything, you got closer to kind of like the ideal candidates. If people are applying, and like you've mentioned, like you guys aren't necessarily paying like the most out in the market, like you're paying a fair wage, but not like the absolute most. Are there other factors that you guys are offering, or other things that are maybe not necessarily dollars compensation related that you guys are offering that do attract the type of people that you're looking for?
Yeah, I mean, we have like, again, as with everybody, you're looking for different ways to get your dollars to stretch farther. I think that we have a very, very ambitious and aggressive PTO policy. In terms of the days that we have off, we added, Juneteenth and MLK to ours as part of our kind of more diversity investments over the past couple of years. We increased total number of vacation days after, a certain number of years of tenure. We're looking into other kind of different investments that we can make. We do our retreat. We offer flexibility, in terms of how people are actually able to operate, and people can live wherever they want. And they can work wherever they want as long as they can effectively complete their role. And so I think that's another big part of kind of owning who you are and what you have to offer, and knowing that if that's not aligned with somebody's goals for their career prospects, don't you want to know that now?
Yeah.
I think one analogy I can use to this is if you're dating and you want kids, don't you think it's important to know if your potential partner doesn't want children? No, no one is better than the other, but that's a very serious misalignment in terms of a effective and cohesive partnership. We kind of view this in the same way. We want to go out there and say, these are the things that we can offer. These are the benefits packages. This is our PTO policy. This is the salary that we can offer. These are the bonuses that we target based on performance of the company. And we say, tell us if this works for you, because if this works for you, then we will continue to invest in all those intangibles, those little things that somebody might say, hey, I got access to this person. I got, exposure to something that I wouldn't have gotten. I have a chance to work in a vertical that I've always wanted to work with. Those are going to be different for individuals. But by going out there and being explicit about who we are and what we have to offer for it, it lets us kind of hold our ground on that a little bit and know that we're not trying to say, hey, we're not adapting our process to one individual. We are saying that we want people to opt into it. And to your earlier point, I wouldn't necessarily say that we got closer to the ideal candidate, because I think those ideal candidates were still in our pool. I think what we've got is we've got better visibility into those ideal candidates because we've been able to mitigate some of these unqualified candidates for one reason or another. Right. And so, for example, there's a couple of states that we don't hire from because it's very, very difficult to stand up operations in certain states. And so we tell people that up front. I don't want to waste somebody's time on my side or yours with a phone screen if you live in a state that we're not set up to operate in. I get it. There are other people who choose to operate there. For us, we made the decision that we didn't feel confident that we could operate. And so having that out there up front, I think really just lets us get past the point of kind of feeling each other out. And I think it's also consistent with our values and the way that we try to speak directly about the things that we're offering rather than obfuscating it behind, hey, like we have this range, but it's $100,000 salary range. Like you may not even bother. I know when New York rolled out their their mandatory PAL salary transparency, there were people like, yes, this job pays anywhere from $1 to $999,999 a year.
Right.
And it's like, I mean, technically that's correct, but that doesn't help somebody go in there. You're still putting it out there, which really kind of sets the stage for it being more of an adversarial negotiation versus one to say, do you want to be here? Because we want people who want to be here, right? I think I don't know any organization that would refute that statement. Mm-hmm. I think the difference and where salary transparency really helped us in this is that we took the first step to say, this is what we want. We want somebody who has these skills, but we also want somebody who believes this is a fair and reasonable compensation for your skills and the rest of the benefits package that Knucklepuck can offer.
Yeah. Now, I'm gonna preface this already with, this is not legal advice by any means, but I'm really curious, being an agency owner as you are and making the decision that you have not necessarily to do business in certain states. Would you mind sharing? Like, are you comfortable sharing like what some of those states are, and just give me an example or two of what are some of the limitations you see in operating in those states?
Yeah. So I don't know that all the specifics of it anymore when we went through this, but I think New York is one, for example, where you are required to set up a number of different insurance policies for having employees in the state. And so there are ones where we have to then take on additional liability insurance. We have to take on additional expenses outside of the employees simply to hire somebody who lives in that state. And so that's the way that we looked at it. You know, we would love to be able to open up everywhere, but it's kind of the same point that I've been making here. We have to be realistic about what we can support. And we're not a super large organization, you know, so it's one where we have to look into it and say, I am choosing to say I want to reduce some of these administrative or operating costs that are incumbent in certain states so that we can reinvest in more competitive salaries. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of it comes down to some of these pieces where some states have much higher bar for being able to set up operations in there than others. And in a lot of ways, that can get to be kind of cost and resource prohibitive mm-hmm. for an organization our size.
Yeah. Well, not only to mention, you know, I'm not a tax professional, but I do have lots of people in my network who are, and we talk about this often. But also opening up operations, having employees in other states also can expose you to state income tax nexus, or other types of taxes. So I think you're spot on, Brett. And if I were to convey to maybe some of our listeners who are just new to the business world and have thought for the longest time that this is just a talking point that maybe, you know, more conservative or right-leaning folks are parroting about why regulation stifles business. I mean, this right here is a tangible example of why. I mean, Knucklepuck isn't going to be hiring from certain places. They're not going to be offering certain jobs in certain states because of the fact that the regulations are so high. And I just want to affirm, Brett, I think you're not the only one experiencing that. So mm-hmm. I think that's definitely an experience among a lot of digital agency owners.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, we can't afford it. We can't afford to do business in that state because of what it requires. I would have to reduce headcount. I would have to reduce comp from other people who have, you know, proven and delivered on the value of that investment. And so I think looking at that again, I think it's much more impactful for smaller businesses than it is for larger ones. Mm-hmm. Larger ones have more of a kind of an umbrella footprint that it's easier to be able to spin up or spin down. But again, if we're small and we've been recruiting, we've had to set up operations in states, and then an employee would leave after a year or two, and then we shut it down, and then we hire somebody again. We have to start it up again. So it does become an administrative and operational burden. And I think different companies are going to have a different risk tolerance and threshold for which they can kind of deal with that. But for us and some of the things that we wanted to be able to invest in, I could not invest in the initiatives that I view as most valuable and most critical for the organization if I was, you know, if you know, 5, 10, 15% more of our budget has to go towards these administrative and operational costs.
Yeah, that's totally right. Well, I want to pull on a thread, Brett, that you had brought up earlier, which had to do with remote work. So back in 2021, you guys went fully remote. What would be some of the challenges that you've experienced specifically in maintaining team cohesion and productivity? And what are some of the measures that you've put in place to address the challenges you're facing?
Yeah, so I think it's relevant to note here where we went fully remote in 2020 when COVID happened and our lease expired in 21. And so we did have an in-office environment for the first 6 years of the business, based in Arlington, Virginia, and all of our people were within within probably a 20, maybe 30-mile range. I think we had some folks that had a little bit of a longer commute. But when we shifted to fully remote, obviously we did a short term for COVID. And then I actually got feedback from the team that, hey, we do want to come back into an office. We want a hybrid environment. And we want, these different things. We want, one weird example I remember, we want to shower in the building because if I bike in or if I exercise during the day, I could do that at home. And, I'm not going to come back to my desk being all sweaty. And so, I went through and negotiated all these other pieces for it. And then we reopened our existing office and nobody came in. The people who said, hey, I'll come in 2 days a week, 3 days a week. We mandated nothing so that we're clear here. Mm-hmm. Knucklepuck did not mandate that people come back to the office. Mm-hmm. But when we surveyed and we asked what people wanted, we seemed to get some initial feedback that an in-office environment was desirable. In practice, it wasn't. And I think that was a really interesting shift in terms of how I thought about remote work, because whether or not somebody says they want something or believes that they want something, at the end of the day, when boots hit the ground, it's a matter of where you put your time and where you kind of make progress. And for us, when I saw that people weren't coming in, I brought it up in an all hands meeting. And I got a question, something along the lines of like, so are you going to send another survey? And I said, no, I go to the office every day. I'm going to write down the names of the people who come in and I'm going to tally it up at the end of the next 3 weeks. Because I can't I think at that point with the new lease we were signing, even with the cut rate deals, I was talking about a $200,000 commitment for this office space over 3 years, something like that. And that was one where that's $200,000 that isn't going towards all these other things that we've been talking about. That's not an insignificant amount of money. And so a lot of those kind of went into the calculus here. And I think for me personally, I am a very extroverted person. My natural leadership style is definitely more conducive to an in-person environment. But my industry is much more conducive to a digital nomad, remote culture, remote opportunities for it. And so when we looked at that, there wasn't a clear answer for us. There wasn't a objectively, yes, this is all the yeses, the other ones are bad options. We had good options either way, and we chose what we believe to be the best option for the future of the company, which was to go fully remote, was to give our people the opportunity to move. We have several people who've been with us for many years, and I'm pretty sure almost all of them who lived in driving distance of our office have since moved to places with lower cost of living, back towards family where, to be able to start families of their own. And I think another piece of that really comes in is we had this happen during COVID or right after COVID. So we had been remote and we had one of our folks said, I want to move to Colorado. And we looked at it and we said, all right, well, we really like you. You're good at your job. You've proven that you can be effective in a remote environment. And then we couldn't come up with real compelling counters to that, right? It was things where it's like, is this really somebody that we are going to choose to replace rather than working with them in this capacity? So we kind of, before we lost the lease, we even had folks start to move that said, hey, I'd love to continue working at Knucklepuck. I just don't want to continue living in one of the highest cost of living areas in the country. I think Virginia has like 3 of the top 10 most expensive counties to live in the US. Wow. And, that's meaningful, and I think it's one of those areas that at the end of the day, looking at the workforce and looking at the people that we wanted to recruit, going back to your very first question about recruiting, the best talent, I did not see a path forward for Knucklepuck that I could insist on an in-office environment. I could not make a case to myself, let alone my executive team, why mandating an in-office environment was going to be better than allowing this remote. Not to say there weren't benefits for it, not to say that in-person collaboration and the organic kind of conversations and relationship building isn't something that is challenging to recreate. We have had to change a lot of the way that we operate as a business to be more conducive to this. One big example, and I'd almost call it maybe a casualty of the push towards remote, is that we have really reduced our focus and investment on junior entry-level positions. We had a really, really robust, super successful junior program where we'd have people on for 6 months in a junior role. At 6 months, if they earned it, they'd be promoted to a consultant, and then they can work their way up from there. The person, my number 2, started as a junior SEO. The person who runs our client services team started as a junior paid. And as we moved fully remote, we found that while we could still put together the training regimens, we could still provide the same resources, we weren't seeing the same accelerated growth that we were able to in our in-office environment. And I am sad for that. Genuinely, I'm genuinely sad for the fact that it's been difficult for us to crack that. And not to say that we won't ever hire junior entry level people, but given the way that employee costs have increased, given our commitment to wanting to go and make sure that we're giving, big raises, I have our big, hairy, audacious goal to drop another EOS kind of claim here. Our 10-year target is I want to give like $2 million in bonuses. And I can't do that if everything is tied up in some of these other pieces. And so I think a lot of it comes down to, being able to look at what circumstances are realistically and with eyes open, and being able to say, what is an acceptable compromise for me as a leader of an organization? And for me, as somebody who is very extroverted, who really does miss the in-office, who really struggles to focus a lot of the time in a fully remote environment where I don't have community accountability to help keep me on top of things, that was one of the things that we had to account for in the calculus. But at the end of the day, looking at the ability to recruit, the ability to tell our team and to really back it up with our actions and say that we want to be employee friendly. We want this to be an area that people choose to work. They choose to bring their talents for it. They understand why we do the things that we do. Going back to salary transparency, they understand why we pay them what we do because it's what we can afford. They understand the range at which they can move up within those bands. And so that was kind of one of the biggest drivers for us there is just having to make a tough call about what the business needs. And the last thing that I will say on that point, I said this even in 2020, where I am hugely skeptical of the hybrid model because you create two cultures. You create an in-office culture that has certain relationships, certain bonds. Then you have a remote culture that has a separate set of rules. And I think that that's the hardest of the three, to do fully remote or fully in person. I totally understand when people say, hey, we want to be in person, but people have to be able to commute on a regular basis and have some work from home. But the hybrid piece where you can have some people fully remote, some people in the office is really, really difficult to be able to back up, your words in terms of what you're trying to do.
Your observation that you noticed junior staff not doing as well, accelerating and growing when you went to a fully remote environment, that's unfortunately something I've heard, not even just in the digital agency space, but also in the accounting world. That's been something that's been talked about in my circles as well. And I think it's an interesting thing. And what I'm trying to wrap my head around is this the result of maybe less than effective means and mechanisms for conveying and educating people? Or is it just the nature of when you're physically in proximity, there's just naturally going to be more, like overlap or just spontaneous conversations that happen? Like, from your perspective, what do you think it is? Is it a technology issue where we just don't have a good enough way of educating people in a remote setting? Or is it because we miss out on those opportunities to kind of rub shoulders, or maybe something else completely different?
So before I answer that, I do want to just put a little nuance to something that you said there, because what I heard you say is that the junior staff are not able to accelerate the way that they used to. And my position is that that's our responsibility. I don't think this is something that, it's not that junior folks are incapable of doing these things. It's the fact that I can only speak for my organization, but my organization had a really, really successful and impressive program when we could be in person, and it was difficult to translate that to a remote environment. So I don't put this on the junior folks. I do a lot of mentoring and a lot of kind of young professional kind of development work. And I feel for these people who are having to go out there because it's harder for businesses to be able to create these opportunities for them to grow. And so to get back to your specific question here, I think there is a tremendous amount to be said for organic interactions. And I think that is the biggest thing, that is the biggest challenge in a remote environment, is being able to facilitate organic interactions. If I walk past your desk when we're in the office and I see you sitting there like this, and I see you kind of pulling at your hair, and I see somebody who hasn't blinked in 2 minutes, I can walk over and be like, what's going on? Like, somebody can trigger a question, whereas in a remote environment, yeah, you can ask the questions for it, but they're not organic. They have to raise their hand and say, I'm having a problem, rather than being able to look around and say, hey, this is taking place. I also think that just the isolated nature of remote also makes it more challenging, because you don't just think of like, oh, hey, I'm walking into the conference room. Hey, Tony, this is probably good for you to hear. Like, come on with me, because I see you. I walk past your desk. You were in the same space. I find we have to be more conscious of it. You have to make much more conscious behaviors to be able to facilitate that type of growth and development. And it's one of those pieces that we've continued to try to find ways to make it work, but we have really changed our strategic direction and say we're going to kind of pursue more experienced people. We had to reassess what we were looking at in terms of, our comp bands, and saying, hey, if we're not going to have junior support folks in here anymore, then like we need to have more seasoned people who can still function in a support role. We have to be able to budget for that. And so that's where I think it's the lack of organic interaction that I don't know anybody who's really cracked that yet. And so what I will say is I think a lot of this is also a function of the fact that we're kind of in between. Like, we're in between generations here, right? Where you think of people who are coming out of college now, or entering the workforce now, are entering it over the last 5 years being presumably in a remote capacity. But all the organizations that are accepting them, all the managers that are taking on these new people, all the people training them, arguably have the majority of their professional experience grounded in an in-office setting.
That's right.
And so that's where you see some of the companies that have been fully remote from the beginning, the ones that have said, hey, we attract people even before we were, remote was as ubiquitous as it is. We attracted people who have a certain set of skills, a different degree of personal accountability and autonomy, versus somebody who maybe can do incredibly good work, but maybe needs a little bit of focus for their attention. I'm one of those people, I think, in a lot of ways. And so when we look at this, I think that's one of the areas that we continue to work on it. But as we shift more and we get more years under our belt, we get another generation entering the workforce that is entering this dynamic, I think you will start to see a natural progression and evolution of the way that companies manage culture moving forward to account for this.
Yeah. Now I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball, because I think you brought up the point, or we're talking about the point of, probably fewer junior staff, being realistic, probably fewer junior staff, probably more senior staff who can handle things relatively autonomously with little additional kind of direction and training. One thing that I've heard come up when it comes to just general agency model is typically a more pyramid style model. Whether it's right or wrong is beside the point. But I think typically what I've seen is that agencies will benefit from that triangle, in the sense that, there is a lot of maybe more low level, less revenue generating type of activities, but still need to get done. And so they can benefit from additional labor at lower costs, which is why you then have that kind of junior staff addressing that bottom layer. When you no longer have that more junior staff helping you with those types of tasks, I guess, has that been a friction point or a challenge you guys have faced as you've shifted your strategy?
Yeah, I think so. I think the nice thing about it is a lot of these AI tools coming out now are providing more technology solutions for some things that could be sent down to entry level, or notes, recaps. I used to have juniors used to sit in on my calls, any biz dev call, and then they would write the recap for me. And not just because I needed somebody to write the recap, but because then I could say, what did you think was important here?
Mm.
You go on all into the spectrum. The person who says like maybe somebody missed 3 or 4 major points. Maybe somebody transcribed our entire 45-minute conversation and gave me a 7-page recap. And I said, I can't read this. And that gave us a training opportunity. It gave us a natural point for us to go in there and be like, this is what's important for you. This is what to focus on. And I think a lot of that can be translated into training these AI models. You can go back and say, this is the way that I want my recap written. This is the key information. This is how I want my next steps formatted. You still got to put the work in, but you're putting the work into technology that was otherwise something that we could use some junior folks for as they gained the skill set necessary to manage these projects on their own. We actually at Knucklepuck, we always viewed our junior program as much more of a pipeline to consultants than as, interns. We wanted them to be involved in projects. We wanted them to do the work, but then we would sit there and say, all right, now we're going to go through and show you what needs to be done on this. Now we're going to show you how are you going to contribute to, the next iteration of this. A lot of technology now is a very similar approach. And so I think that's one of the things that we've really tried to focus on. We're starting to do more investments in it this quarter, going into the end of 24, so that we can say, if we're not going to have the, doing more of those administrative support tasks, how do we still ensure that our consultant levels and our senior folks still have that support? Because I don't want them sitting and writing a recap either, right? And so I think being able to have some of these technology tools that have been emerging, I think it's good timing. It's fortuitous timing for businesses that are reckoning with, how are you going to be able to fulfill the functions of your organization? But I do think that, not having that pipeline forward, it changes the recruitment focus. It changes, the way that we have to look in terms of, how much runway somebody has to prove that they can do it. I think one of the other nice things that we liked about having junior folks, because, was that we could afford them to make mistakes, because we weren't requiring, we were able to say they're comped at a level based on their expertise, and then we increase their comp as their expertise increases. And if their expertise doesn't increase as quickly, there's less pressure on an organization to cut a employee that may be not being able to deliver value commensurate with a higher salary. And so I think that was one of the other things that we've had to shift and try to change around, because you hire these more expensive resources, deservedly so, right? This is not to say these folks don't deserve the higher comp at a more senior role, but at a higher comp comes higher expectations.
That's right.
Comes a shorter runway and a shorter tolerance for mistakes and missteps along the way, because they become more expensive. Becomes more expensive to train and to let somebody go through that process of learning on their own when, you're required to pay them significantly more.
Yeah, that's right. Man, there are so many things that you had mentioned there that I just want to ask you a bunch more questions to kind of dive deeper. And we've only gotten through half of our questions, but we're already coming up to the top of the hour. So I'm just thinking, Brett, we might have to do part 2 of this interview, because there's still so many things for us to talk about as it relates to
I'd love it. Let's see if we can
get
get any of our listeners today to share some comments. See if somebody wants to challenge some of the things that I've said on that. I think that's healthy. I think that's how we are able to really be able to have an effective conversation. If we can go out there and say, hey, I don't think this is correct, or this isn't the experience that I've had for these reasons. And so I would love it. Let me see if I can hit enough numbers to make me a compelling return guest for you here.
That would be so great. Well, I mean, just so the listeners can get a sense for some of the other things we are going to be talking about in the future, if we can get Brett back on the show. But things like making the decision between when is it right for us to be using a full-time employee versus a contractor to fulfill work. Things like, how do you decide whether or not to have the services that you're offering to your clients be something that's directly under the Knucklepuck banner versus using just a directly outsourced provider, having the client go directly to that outsourced provider. We're talking about all these types of things. probably in part 2 of the episode, Brett. But before we go, I just want to provide an opportunity for our listeners, if they had follow-up questions or they want to get to know you better, follow what Knucklepuck's doing, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so our website is knucklepuckmedia.com. Side fact, there is a punk band called Knucklepuck that will not sell me knucklepuck.com. So if anybody's out there and they're not even using it, I wouldn't expect them to sell if they were using it. But so Knucklepuck Media is our domain. Brett at Knucklepuck Media, Brett with 2 T's, is my direct email. And then LinkedIn is always a really great opportunity for some of these more quick and easy kind of points. You'll definitely see me posting excerpts from this interview, and probably I'm thinking 5 to 6 individual ones, carving out some of the sound bites here to make it digestible. Because I think that at the end of the day is why I started Knucklepuck. I wanted to be able to be a part of this industry and this field that I love. I still think it's fascinating. I've been doing SEO for 15 years, or at least been involved in SEO for 15 years. And I still find it really fascinating how everything has to evolve as new technology comes through. Paid media had a whole, like Facebook ads, had a whole about face when Apple changed their privacy settings. And so these are the kind of things that I personally, welcome and encourage that kind of feedback, because it helps me learn. It helps challenge me on whether or not my perspective shouldn't evolve with new information. And so, like I said, I think LinkedIn would be great. Shoot me a comment and let's have a discussion.
I love it. Brett, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your perspectives. You truly are a leader in this space, and I look forward to part 2 of our interview.
Likewise, it's been a real pleasure. I can't wait to be back.
And thank you to our listeners. If you found value in our episode today, please leave us a review and tell your friends about us. If you're interested in being a guest on our show, as a digital agency owner, or maybe somebody with insights that can help digital agencies grow, head over to our website to learn more at acquip.com/podcast guest. That's acquip.com/podcast guest.